Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and don't forget to subscribe to me, etc., etc. And so with that, let's really start talking about what we're going to be talking about today, and that is teens and their habits online. Now, if you recall, a couple of days ago, I did a segment on essentially a mother that is suing Character.ai for the generative AI that got her autistic son addicted. Character AI also was involved in a teen death in Florida earlier this year as well. And so teens, for the record, are pretty much never offline. They're almost always constantly online, and I think that is a serious issue. Their habits are different than their parents, and so let's talk about the long-term ramifications of this situation. Now, this information is coming from two places. First, we're going to talk about what Pew Research just found in their latest survey regarding this, and then we're going to talk about the longitudinal health issues and ramifications as Yale Medicine describes it as well. So we've got good sources here, and let's dive in, because Pew is saying some really interesting things, especially that most teens use social media and have a smartphone, and nearly half say they're online almost constantly. And that is according to Pew's latest survey of teens aged 13 to 17 that they conducted between September 18 through October 10th of 2024. So let's go through some of these responses that essentially these teens are giving Pew. YouTube, interestingly enough, tops the list of online platforms that essentially were asked about in the survey. 9 in 10 teens report using YouTube, and that's slightly down from 95% in 2022. TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat are still widely used among teens. 6 in 10 say they use TikTok and Instagram. 55% say they're on Snapchat. Facebook and X, aka Twitter, interestingly enough, have steeply declined over the past decade. Only 32% of teens say they use Facebook. As I mentioned, they don't have the same habits as their parents. You know, if you're a millennial or older, you grew up, and for lack of a better term, in the Facebook era, when Facebook was the behemoth and essentially the only game in town, followed by Instagram, obviously Twitter, now X, alongside of it. So 32% of teens say that they're doing that, but that's down from 71% back in 2014, 2015, when Facebook was really blowing up. And basically the share of teens who use the site has remained stable in recent years. 17% of teens say that they use X, formerly Twitter, and about half the share basically of them basically said a decade ago that 33% were using it. And that's down from 23% in 2022. And that makes sense because since Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, renamed it X, they've seen a population decline across the board of all age demographics as basically Twitter has turned vastly more political, and so people have just simply been leaving. Now, on top of that, roughly 1/4 of teens, or 23%, say that they use WhatsApp. That's up 6 points since 2022. 14% of teens use Reddit. That's been rather consistent as well. And for the first time, Pew asked about Threads. This is the Twitter knockoff that Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, aka Meta, basically spun up in 2023 to combat, Elon Musk's Twitter. It blew up and then it kind of died, and only 6% of teens are using that, which is pretty much a death knell for that longitudinally. So the question is then, how often do teens visit these online platforms? And debates about teen and social media often center about how much time that they're spending online on these platforms. Lawmakers obviously have been looking at regulations. Australia just passed a regulation saying that essentially 16 and under cannot use social media, or rather you have to be 16 to use social media in Australia, etc., etc. But Pew's 2023 survey found that a majority of Americans here support time limits for minors on social media. Now, of basically the current survey in terms of questions on the major platforms, teens were asked how often they use the 5 platforms: YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook, obviously excluding X and Threads that just really didn't have any of them on there. So overall, 73% of teens say they go on YouTube daily, and that makes YouTube the most widely used platform for teens. Now, that share also includes 15% of teens who say that they're on there almost constantly. Now, 6 in 10 visit TikTok daily. 16% basically say they're on there almost constantly. Instagram and Snapchat have about 50% of teens that go on there every day. About 10% say that's constantly. And the share of teens who say they use Instagram has increased slightly as well, from 8% in 2023 to 12% today in 2024. And relatively few teens, as I mentioned, talked about using Facebook or mentioned they use Facebook daily. Only 20% did. Now, across all 5 of these platforms, 1/3 of all teens basically are using at least one of these sites almost constantly. In other words, they're not getting off their phones or however they're accessing it, and they are accessing it in different ways. Now, in previous surveys, and this is interesting if we're breaking this down by gender, teen girls are more likely than boys to use TikTok almost constantly, 19% to 13%. Teen boys are the flip on YouTube, 19% of boys, and 11% among girls are using it constantly. And it also breaks down amongst race and ethnicity as well, because roughly 1/4 of Black teens, or 28%, Hispanic teens, 25%, say they visit TikTok almost constantly, but only 8% of white teens say that as well. So Black and Hispanic teens are also more likely than white teens to say they constantly use YouTube or Instagram. And so Pew states that there are few to no racial ethnic differences between Snapchat and Facebook visits as well by teens, but I'd be curious to dive in. And for the record, I'm only giving you the highlights of this report that is pages long. I highly suggest you go read it. I will be linking it in the comments as well as the Yale link also. So the next question then obviously is, what devices do teens have to basically access this at home? And you would think smartphone, and obviously you would be right on that, but there are more ways that they're doing this. So large shares of teens have access or actually have a smartphone themselves. That's 95% of teens, followed by desktop computer or laptop computer at 88%. Gaming consoles come in at 83%, although Twitch wasn't mentioned, interestingly enough. And tablet computers come in at 70% at home. Overarchingly and overall, smartphone, computer, and gaming console ownership has remained stable, meaning you're not really adding or subtracting from that in terms of use percentages. But the share of teens that say they have access to tablets has indeed risen from 65% last year to 70% today. In other words, tablets are being more adopted than laptops and desktop computers. And, unless you're gaming or need hardcore productivity, a tablet can do pretty much everything you want. So there's a lot more, as I mentioned, that you should read from this survey. And I'm going to link this in the comments section in YouTube and my SoundCloud channels. Try to do it on social media, though some doesn't lend itself to that. But let's talk about how social media is affecting the mental health of teens. And as I mentioned, Yale Medicine had an article out of June of 2024 talking about this. And in the spring of 2023, basically the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, basically here in the United States, released an advisory called Social Media and Youth Health, in which he says there's a growing evidence or body of evidence that social media is causing harm to young people's mental health. Now, soon after that, the APA, or American Psychological Association, issued their own health advisory. And then in June of 2024, Dr. Murthy again called for a Surgeon General's warning label on social media platforms. If you recall, the Surgeon General put them on cigarettes decades ago. I believe it was like the 80s or 70s. And by virtue of that, studies show that actually helped curb or at least cut down on the use of tobacco, specifically cigarettes. And so why not? I think that's a good idea. So this issue, though, is complicated because while there are indicators that it can have a profound risk of harm to teens, and I'm going to be talking about that shortly, social media use basically aimed at making healthy connections with others can actually be beneficial to some people, teens or adults. Dr. Murthy's report indicates that more research is needed to fully understand the impact of social media. And so that means if you're a parent, there's no easy answers, but Dr. Murthy's, basically his report stresses that the brain is going through a highly sensitive period between the ages of 10 through 19, which identifies both identities of feelings, self-worth. All this stuff is basically coming to fruition. Essentially, you're becoming mentally and emotionally who you are during that period. And so according to the report, and I quote, frequent social media use may be associated with distinct changes in the developing brain. Now that potentially affects basically functions such as emotional learning and behavior, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Now outside of the Yale study, Jean Twenge, who wrote iGen, also had a very large longitudinal study on these kinds of things, but specifically looking at depression and suicidality in teen boys and teen girls. And the correlation that they were able to make, and I understand correlation is not necessarily causation, but essentially if you map the explosion of Facebook starting between 2011 and 2013, all the way through, what you saw was, as that was rising, you also saw a steady rise in depression and suicidality in both teen boys and especially in teen girls. And essentially, the recommendation coming from that research was you really shouldn't be starting in social media unless you want to be a super well-adjusted person until the age of 19. So Dr. Murthy's report, as Yale is reporting, essentially dovetails with this. So the real question is, outside of the benefit of positive social interaction, it seems like there's more downsides. And so the question is, what are the potential harms of social media use by teens? Now, over the last decade, increasing evidence has identified the potential negative impact of social media on adolescents. And according to research study of American teens aged 12 to 15, those who use social media over 3 hours each day faced twice the risk of having negative mental health outcomes, including depression and anxiety symptoms. Now, the advisory states that other studies, quote, point to a higher relative concern of harm in adolescent girls and those already experiencing poor mental health, as well as for particular health outcomes such as cyberbullying related depression, body image and disordered eating behaviors, and poor sleep quality linked to social media use. What's more, the social media algorithms are built to promote whatever you seem interested in. If a teen searches for any kind of mental health condition, such as depression or suicide, it's going to feed them information about those things. So soon they may begin to think that everybody around them is depressed or thinking about suicide, which is not necessarily good for mental health. End quote. And yes, we talked about that, I want to say a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago here, essentially on one of my segments, where there was a rash on TikTok of people thinking that they had essentially a disease, whether it was autism or something else, because they were getting inundated due to the algorithms on TikTok saying, well, you might have it if you have this, if you have that. Well, now you're being mentally prepared to say, well, yeah, I kind of do twitch in some weird way or whatever it was. And so by virtue of that, I must be autistic or whatever it was. These are things that happen. Copycats happen. If you start to get the impression and it's reinforced over and over, then basically you may start believing it. This is what happens with disinformation as well, whether it's politics or any other kind of disinfo. So some researchers think that exposure to social media can overstimulate the brain's reward center, and basically when the stimulation becomes excessive, it can trigger pathways that are comparable to addiction. Excessive use has also been linked to sleep problems, attention problems, and feelings of exclusion in adolescents, and sleep is obviously essential for the healthy development of teens, not to mention adults need it too, according to this advisory. So this obviously is a very longitudinal, long-term issue. But quite frankly, if I'm looking at social media use and what it's done to society, it has not overarchingly been beneficial at all. We are more depressed. We are more addicted. Our kids are more depressed. Our kids are more addictive. It has had long-term detrimental effect, not to mention driving wedges in society through disinformation, ramping up of anger over politics and everything else. The first time that I signed up for Twitter, or I should say the first time I posted on Twitter when I first signed up, I got pulled into an argument by two people I don't know who were dropping expletives at each other, not to mention deeply racist expletives. And my first thought was, people use this? And they do. And I think that's one of the real issues that we've got. I think that as you look at other studies that show if you take a break from social media, whether you're a teen or an adult, oftentimes you come back and you feel a lot better about yourself because you're completely disconnected from this. Like, I don't listen to a lot of the vitriol that I sometimes get on social media, especially if I've done a video like on Elon Musk or something like that. I was called the world's stupidest man for something like 3 weeks after I did that, and that was not fun, but at the same token, I just ignore it. And I'm better off for doing that. So we all need to disconnect at some point. That is essentially your news of the day, and hopefully you're limiting your time. But if you are a parent and you've got teens, understand the best possible outcome that you have for your kids is to not let them have social media until they are at the age of 19. And remember, your job isn't to be a friend. Your job is to parent first. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private. Thanks, everybody.